there are, what are the tools to control mycotoxin? Again, I have to emphasize that mycotoxin, they are not alive. They are a very stable chemical substance. They are resistant against high or low temperature. And then they actually do not decrease during storage. And they can resist most of the processing conditions. Although most countries, it's highly regulated. But then aflatoxin B1 is the most strictly regulated, I think. If you visit all the feed mills, always they have some sort of screening for this. But remember that the maximum allowable level set by the government or set in the systems is not equivalent to physiological safe levels. That's one of the challenge. Like for example, this one is the allowable permitted levels in EU. For example, aflatoxin B1 is 20 ppb per corn. I think in Asia, in the Philippines, the level is something like 50 ppb. So they can accept raw material within the 50 ppb level. What I mean physiological is that in the animal performance or in the disease, actually even low level or combination of low level is more damaging than single high level of mycotoxin contamination. So again, molds are visible, I agree. They are bitter and smelly. That's why there are some colleagues or workers in the mill that they only see the raw material. They can say, oh, I know this is contaminated. But unfortunately, if you look on the side of mycotoxins, these things you cannot see, you cannot taste, and there's no odor. Basically, you cannot say that just by looking on the raw material if the corn is contaminated or not, or the level is safe or not. So with the experts, there is one group in Nutriad that working only on mycotoxin risk management, and these are the steps that we normally suggest. Basically just going through the steps. Step one will be the screening of raw material before going into the feed mill. And then, of course, the second step is just in the storage of this raw material to make sure that you preserve it. And then the third step is the screening of the finished feed. Remember that the raw material or the grains that you screen is not the only content that you add into the finished product. Normally, you add other raw materials that are not probably part of the screening test. And then, of course, number 4 is the application of the mycotoxin deactivators to control or to help. I would say that step 4 is just an insurance to make sure that the animals are protected or are able to recover the challenge. Just going through the steps. Mycotoxin risk management, this is the thing that we can plan, or your company or your operations can actually set up your own HACCP plan in accepting of the acceptance level of your mycotoxins in the raw material. Remember that, okay, there is a government regulation, but there's no stopping you from having your own regulation as well, because mycotoxins, as bad as I already mentioned, is carcinogenic. No, I mean in human, in the food side, this might be one of the main cause of our cancers, especially if you like to eat those grains. It's important to have the internal acceptable level, and then to make use of a rapid test kits. Nowadays it's good because there's so many companies that have developed a very accurate, very fast testing. You can divide it into a more complex water-based testing. More easy water-based testing, or those that using chemicals for extraction. So you can have the sample tested while the truck is waiting before unloading. You know already what is the level within maybe 15 to 30 minutes. You have the result. So of course, in those cases where you don't have a chance but to really accept it because you don't have any raw material to buy, then maybe it's important to know the level so you can manage it. Maybe combine it with your existing raw material that has a low level inside the feed mill. Now, second step is in the storage. There are some regulations depending on countries. I think in our area it should be like 12% moisture if you buy the product, or even lower, of course, the better. And the part of the seller, the higher the moisture is good, and the lower for them is of course bad. But then in our case, if you plan to store the grains for more than 3 to 6 months, then moisture will play an important role on how you're going to stabilize or preserve that particular raw material. And you can store it depending on how long, depending on how high the moisture is. And you can use a different mold inhibitor available in the market. We only suggest, of course, if your silos are aerated, then you cannot use a free acids. Maybe you need to go into those buffered mold inhibitors. And normally the free acids are the cheapest, but then if your silo is aerated, then it can easily be solubilized. Whereas the buffered is slowly released and will be able to protect the raw material for a long period of times. And there's also a test that we can do for that. So the third step is the screening of finished feeds. Again, as I mentioned, because if you only, this is some sort of validating what you are doing on the first part. If you're really screening the raw material before coming in, then you should be able to see the reduction of that in your finished feed. The only issue is that we cannot use, or most of the rapid test kits available are not validated for finished feeds. The main reason is that finished feed is more complex. But then, okay, you can still use it as a guide maybe. Some people use it. You have to just input the highest level, because if you use the rapid test kit, it's dependent on the raw material. So maybe if you're using only corn soy diet, then you can put it as a standard there, as the basis for the rapid test. But what we suggest is to use really HPLC, high pressure liquid chromatography, or LCMS, or liquid chromatography with, because this one is more specific. It's more intended for complex feed. So normally this is just a second step, so that you can check that what you're doing on the first and second is actually working. Okay? Of course, on the last step, the application of the mycotoxin deactivator is also suggested, but remember that there's no official method on this. There's no really special method. But what is, maybe the decision will rely depending on the strategy that you wanted to employ. How sensitive is the target species, for example. Sometimes in EU they use a lot of amination, especially for the straw, but then in the grains it might not be practical because you actually moist the grains. In EU also, it's not allowed to use chemicals or those binders that when they treat the feed, it gives a low reading, but then after eating the animal, it's actually released. So that one is also prohibited. So what we do suggest is you really do with a complex mycotoxin deactivators, or what we mean a multifunctional approach, something that can help on binding, deactivation, and then supporting the immune system of the animal. I have to emphasize that there's no 100% protection, because this is highly dependent on the contamination that you have and the dosage range. Because this is my experience when we go around and feed meals, customers who are buying the products, normally they say, oh, you only use 1 kilo and that's all. You leave it in January until December, that will work perfectly fine. And they don't even touch it because, well, I know that's already perfect for us. But actually this problem is something that is dynamic. It has to be adjusted based on the contamination that you have. So the rapid test kit is important, and then it has to be, the dosage range has to be adjusted based on your final mix. That's why in here actually we inserted an app. It's a mobile phone app that we call it MycoMan, where you can input the actual reading that you have, and then that app will recommend to you what kind of level you can use.